Good morning, everyone. My name is Shishir Gupta. I am a senior fellow at CSEP. Thank you so much for taking out the time to attend this seminar on a Monday morning. So, because it's on a Monday morning, a special thanks to all of you. The topic is on municipal finance systems in India and China, and I think all of us know that Indian cities need to improve their service delivery on pretty much all the dimensions, and one of the key areas for improvement are how do we make our cities financially empowered. So I think in that context, sharing India's systems as they exist today and learning from how China managed to build world-class cities is of utmost importance, both as a matter of research and actually more important for us as residents in Indian cities. So thanks a lot. We have an illustrious panel and a power-packed audience. So I'm going to keep it very, very brief in introducing our panelists. First up is Debarpita Roy. Dr. Debarpita Roy is a fellow at CSEP. She focuses on urban. Previously, she has had stints at public policy think tank and private sector. And her recent research interests are in affordable housing and municipal finance. Thank you, Debarpita. Professor O.P. Mathur, undoubtedly one of India's foremost experts on urban.
Not one of India, the one.
Start it again.
We can edit it, so that's the benefit of not streaming it live. He is our visiting senior fellow and also senior fellow at Global Cities Institute, University of Toronto. He has just published his latest book, Changing Paradigms of Urbanization, India and Beyond, which captures 20 of his select articles over the last 4 decades. And it captures how the domain has evolved across multiple dimensions during this time period. Thank you, Professor Mathur. Thank you. Next up is our own President Emeritus and Distinguished Fellow, Dr. Rakesh Mohan. I think all of us know him because he was one of the architects of the economic reforms of 1991, which really transformed India and hence transformed all of us. Along with his other things, he is right now a member of the Prime Minister Economic Advisory Council and the recently appointed Economic Advisory Panel to of the World Bank, which is co-chaired by Lord Nick Stern and the World Bank Chief Economist, Dr. Gill. Finally, our keynote speaker, Professor Christine Wong. Special shout out to you, Professor Wong, for taking out the time. She is a visiting research professor at East Asian Institute, National University of Singapore, and Honorary Professional Fellow at the Asian Institute, University of Melbourne. You also teach international finance at the Tsinghua University, right? Yeah. Professor Wong is an international authority on China's public finance and the public sector reform, and she has held senior staff positions at the World Bank, the ADB, and has been a senior consultant to the IMF and other multilateral agencies. Thank you, Professor Wong, again for taking out the time. So with that...
You were not showing her book. You showed my book, but her book, 1976 book.
1976?
Yes, 1996, sorry. 1996 book on local government finance, which is lying in Rakesh's book.
Okay. Okay.
It's lying in Rakesh's book.
Okay. So with that, I hand it over to, I request Professor Dr. Rakesh Mohan for his opening remarks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Shishir, for organizing this and asking me to open the proceedings. We are really lucky to have such a distinguished scholar of fiscal issues related to urbanization. Professor Christine Wong, thank you so much for being here and thank you to Ashoka for getting her here. Um, he mentioned various things about me. He didn't mention the most important thing, that from 1974 to 1988, I was not interested in anything but urban development. During my PhD thesis at Princeton, then in the World Bank, and then in the Planning Commission, then back in the World Bank, then back in the Planning Commission. So, but then I found that no one was listening to me, so I gave that up and started other things, but not that I found that people listening to me even otherwise after I gave that up. But I couldn't keep giving things up. So however, more seriously, actually my very first paper was as a graduate student in 1974 on urban property taxes in India in 1974. So this is really, I'm so glad that you are here. And I think this is probably the first seminar we've had at CSEP on urban finances, I think. Now, also I see that you have worked closely with some of my old friends from the then urban mafia in the World Bank, including Johannes Lind, and then Greg Ingram, I think, when he was with the Lincoln land policy. So I'm just amazed and sorry that I've not met you before, because you've known all my friends in the urban issue. The other thing is that she's had a really distinction of having taught in all continents except Africa, unless you've taught there also.
That's right.
Yeah, right? US, UK, Hong Kong,
Hong Kong, yeah.
China, Singapore, and Australia. So it's really, you may hold the record for the most sort of widespread coverage of the world on urban issues. So now what you have to do is first come to India for some years. And Ashoka, please lure her. Because we really, in the coming 25 years, we hope that we will finally have some accelerated urban growth, which has been slow till now. So we really need you. And then once you've done that, you can then perhaps teach in Africa, because they will be next in fast urbanization. What is noticeable, I think, between India and China is that if you take some date like 1960, our levels of urbanization was similar, around 16-18% or something of that order. And our GDP per capita in 2015 US dollars was around 240 and for China and 300 or so for India in 2015 dollars. If these numbers are wrong, blame Shishir because he gave them to me. But I think they are right.
And blame the World Bank.
So, but that's, I mean, we were similar actually till about 1980, I think, in terms of per capita income, etc. And also China hadn't had its urban acceleration till after 1980. So now the Chinese per capita income is around $2,500 current US dollars, perhaps a bit lower in 2015 dollars. And the per capita income is 12, so ours is 2,500, theirs is around 12,500 in terms of total per capita income. And that also shows in the level of urbanization, almost 65%, I think, in China, right? And something around 35% here. Unfortunately, we haven't had a census in 2021. Last census was 2011, so we don't quite know how much it is, but probably 35% or so. So I would expect that if we are to accelerate our total growth, that should also accelerate our urban growth. Now, what is very, very surprising is that our urban population growth or total urbanization growth has been quite slow, contrary to many popular impressions. Among various things, for example, people have an impression, like in China, you had huge rural-urban migration, right? Huge, to reach 2/3 or thereabouts of urban population proportion. Here, the migration component, net rural urban migration component of total urban population growth across 4 decades at least, if not longer, is only about 20%. So 80% of urban population growth for the last 4 decades or so has been natural urban population growth, addition of areas around cities, and addition of places categorized as urban. Net rural urban migration is only about 20%. So that's very puzzling actually. Also, according to Shishir's research, that the share of urban GDP in total GDP has remained roughly constant for maybe 25 years or something, which is also very odd, about 50% or so, right? 55% or so. So that's also very odd for a country which has certainly had 6 to 7% annual GDP growth over this period. Also, the urban per capita GDP as a proportion of rural per capita GDP has actually come down in the last 10 years or so. So it's been going up a little bit, around 2.8 10 years back or something like that. Now, from whatever calculations there are, they're about maybe 2.4. That's also very strange. I don't know what the proportion would be in China now, the urban per capita GDP and rural per capita GDP. So,
3.5.
sorry, how much?
3.5.
3.5, yeah. So all these things are sort of very contrary to common understanding. And what also means is that given this stagnation of urban-rural per capita GDP proportion, that it suggests that productivity growth in urban areas has been slowing down. I mean, the whole theory of development and urbanization is structural transformation from lower productivity rural pursuits, agriculture and other things, to higher productivity urban pursuits. And it seems that that productivity difference seems to be going down, which is very odd in terms of, I think, international development history. And therefore, very slow structural transformation in the employment structure as opposed to the output structure, which has been changing relatively fast, but not that fast either. And the question that I have in some sense is the key reason our relative lack of manufacturing growth in the last 25 years or more, which with other countries, that's what sort of propels urbanization and GDP growth, of course, along with the tertiary sector, and services, of course, go along with fast manufacturing growth. Then just coming to municipal finances, so these are some of the issues I think that are of interest, which is why we need you here to do research, to figure out what's happening. On urban financing, most of the resources that local governments have are funds devolved from the central government and state governments. And municipal governments don't have a high proportion of their own finances. Of course, Professor Mathur will talk about that. One of the things there is that earlier we used to have something called the octroi tax, that every good entering a city had to pay a tax, entry tax. It was a very, very bad tax. So that was abolished, but it gave a lot of resources to the local government. That was abolished, but there was nothing that replaced it. So their dependence on devolution went up. Among other things, I'm not sure if this number is correct, but that's what I've read in various pieces, that 65% of government employees in China are at the local level. But you can perhaps correct me if that is right or wrong.
Higher.
Sorry?
Even higher.
Even higher.
Central government is 5%.
Yeah. Whereas in India, only 12% of government employees are at the local level. And that shows in the sense of our terrible systems of urban government, etc. So again, it's very interesting actually. It's also the US also, the proportion of local urban government employees is much, much higher. Similarly, a very low share of total government finances of the local governments. So we're keen to hear from you how China finances very fast urban growth, probably unprecedented in the sense of magnitude. Latin America had possibly had faster urban growth in the 60s and 70s in particular, I think. But in magnitude, of course, China is much more. So it is really a miracle how they've been financed. I've not visited China now for some time, but for anyone who has visited, it's amazing how much investment has taken place in China, in cities. So I'd like to know how has that been financed, how much was devolved funds, how much were own funds, how much was from local taxes like property taxes, how much was through monetization of land, etc. Also, one would like to hear from you the competence of the local government staff, which is extremely low here. It is also not prestigious at all for people to work in municipal corporations, even in the largest cities. So, 15 years ago or more, I was giving I was in a panel in Bombay with about 1,000 in the audience, about 2/3 of whom or 50% of whom were students. So, and our head of then head of Infosys, our biggest IT company, Mr. Narayana Murthy, was me on the panel. So I asked the students to raise your hand if you want to work for the Municipal Corporation of Bombay. Two fellows sort of very gingerly held up their hands. Then I said, how many people do you want to work for Mr. Narayana Murthy in all this stuff he does in something called information technology? And, at least 2/3 of the students raised their hands. So my point is that to have better urban local government, we need to make it more prestigious, because in some sense the problems are so interesting that it should be really absorbing for young people to want to go and work for city governments or authorities. So I'm curious on whether that's the case in China or not. And also, of course, then also the competence. The competence in some sense goes with prestige. So those are many questions in my mind, and thank you again once for being here, and we look forward to listening to you.
Thank you, Dr. Mohan, for setting the stage so very nicely. May I request Devarpita now to tell us briefly about how the Indian system works. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a very tough act to follow, Dr. Mohan, and especially since he has already said 90% of the things that I was planning to say. But nonetheless, please bear with me for the next 10 odd minutes. As Shishir and Dr. Mohan mentioned, that service delivery in our cities need attention, right? And things have really improved over the last 10 years. The last chart, if we look at solid waste collected, this itself was at 70% about 5 years back. Now it is at 95.4%, but that's half the battle won, because just about half of this 95.4% collected waste is actually treated. So we have to traverse the rest, right? Now, the problems become more dynamic and more complex because we are not dealing with a static situation as is business as, status quo situation that we are dealing with today. We are urbanizing, and while the rate might not be as fast as it in other countries, but the quantum of the number of people we are adding to in our cities and the number of bigger cities that are growing, right? Cities are becoming bigger, so meaning more complex problem and more need of finances, right? So on both dimensions, it need attention. Now coming to urban local bodies, like, of course, we are getting into more, our cities are, the number of bigger cities are increasing. Our urban local body structure system is also, very top heavy. That more number of people, now close to 90% of the urban population lives in the bigger municipal corporations or nagar nigams that we call, and municipal councils or nagar parishads, which are roughly covers the vast majority of the urban population. The rest is about 10% lives in our Nagar Panchayats, which are really numerous in number, very, very, very many small cities, but very, widely dispersed across India. Now, across the entire system, even though, our cities are going bigger and they are going fiscally stronger, etc., bigger cities also mean fiscally more stronger cities, but roughly over the last 2 decades, as a proportion of GDP, our municipal finances have been stagnant around 1%, and municipal expenditure even lower. Now, this is to some extent by design, because our ULBs do not have the own source revenue tax handles or the non-tax handles with them. They're really straight state subjects. It's the state governments which are statutorily empowered to define that, okay, what are the functions that a ULB or an urban local body or a municipality should be discharging, and what are the financial handles that they should have. So as a result of which, and it is inherently, it's not a bad thing, right, that our urban local bodies or municipalities are becoming more dependent on the state governments and the central government. State governments and central governments do need to support our urban local bodies. And it happens also globally. It's not that in the developed countries that London, the local government institution governing London doesn't get state support from the UK government. Of course it gets a lot. So same in the case of India. This has to, the amount of transfers from the central government and union government has to increase. But what is worrying is that their own source revenue, the main source of which is the property tax, that too has been roughly constant. While this shows as a proportion of municipal revenue, even as a proportion of GDP, property tax across India as a proportion of GDP has been constant around 0.15%, whereas the potential by various studies empirically has been determined to be about 0.8% of GDP. Now, when talking about municipal finance systems, it's very important that we also talk about the role of these 2 constitutional bodies, CFCs and SFCs, the Central Finance Commission and the State Finance Commission. The Central Finance Commission, if we see over the last 30 years, has been more and more involved in the urban finance space. It's very visible in that even the CFC grants are inching up. And every, finance commissions makes very bold recommendations in terms of what should the state governments do when it comes to municipal finances, what is it that the ULB should be doing when it comes to municipal finances. Not so much can be said about state finance commissions, and it is a, big area of research which is very undertapped as I feel. But there's a wide disparity across states in the role that the state finance commissions play. In some states, they are very empowered bodies. In most of the states, they are not. And thus the impact has been suboptimal at best. I will end with this slide, that currently where are we and where do we need to reach, right? As per the latest World Bank study, and this is more or less in concurrence with the HPEC numbers and the McKinsey numbers of 210, is that we need a capital expenditure of about 1.18% of GDP on urban services, which includes the basic services and urban transport. We are currently averaged at 0.16% between 2011 and 2018. And so it just has to, double. Now, one spanner in the works is that even with the very big municipal corporations, they are not able to capitalize on their full borrowing capacity due to various institutional constraints. The point that Dr. Mohan mentioned, that, with regards to the people working there, with regards to other organizational challenges that, surround these bodies. So that in a nutshell, the messages, of course, in the ULBs have to be fiscally and even overall be empowered, and look forward to Professor Wong to hearing from you that how did China really go about doing it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Debarpita. Before I invite Professor Wong for her keynote, Professor Mathur, anything that you would like to share on the Indian context in addition to what Debarpita has already said?
Not right away, but, during the...
Cool. Okay. Professor Wong, over to you for the keynote. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here. to speak to this very distinguished audience. I hope that I have something of interest to tell you today about China's municipal finance. This is something, so I've been looking at China's public finance for about 35 years. From the beginning, almost from the beginning of reform to current. But today I didn't actually want to give you too many details of how China's system works, because that would take an hour by itself. And I want to jump into talking about financing rural governments. I think that's what I had said I would like to talk about, and that was requested. So if you have any questions about the specifics of how China works, I'm happy to answer those questions as well. And then do feel free to interrupt me. I'm an economist, and we're used to being interrupted in seminars. Okay, I want to start with just a few pictures, which I think are kind of fun to look at. This is Shanghai Pudong, 1970. And keep your eye on that clock tower. That's about 2/3 of the way to the right, because the next slide will be of Shanghai Pudong 2013 with the same clock tower in roughly the same position. Okay. And you can see the change. We can go back to 1970 and then 2013. This is a picture I took from a brochure, so it's kind of glossified, but roughly the same picture, but there's a bit of filling in between 2013 and 2021, but already 2013 quite a lot had changed. And this is a picture I took out of my hotel room window in the Pudong Hyatt, looking to, this is in Pudong, and looking toward Puxi, which is the older part of Shanghai, to see that the old city has also changed, but not quite as much, because you're having to redevelop, occupied or developed areas. That's much harder than Pudong, which was a new area that was farmland before the reforms. Okay, this is just looking at some comparative data around the world. Economic growth typically is concentrated in cities, and countries that are urbanizing tend to grow economically faster. And you see China on the far left, and how much it's urbanized since the beginning of reform. And India is the third one, also urbanizing rapidly. And then Vietnam on the far right, again, another fast-growing economy. And then you have, a range in between. This is the same data as in the graph. I sometimes like to see the numbers themselves and see how they've changed between the two years, 1980 and 2021. So Professor Roy said that India's urban population has grown hugely, while China's urban population grew by almost 700 million over this 40-year period. Huge numbers of people to absorb. You have, so India, 337 additional urban population. Vietnam, also a very large increase. But some surprises. The US also increased urban population by 108 million people. And that, I think Saul and I discussed this. It's probably just suburbanization, urban borders moving out to surround what used to be classified as rural areas, rather than people physically moving to the cities. So the trend is toward, large mega cities. Each country has one or two mega cities, and you have among the 34 mega cities in the world, Tokyo, Delhi, Shanghai, etc. But China's policy has changed. So I put up those two graphs of Shanghai and Beijing. And China no longer encourages first-tier cities to grow. So you see the flatlining of Shanghai at about 25 million, and Beijing at a bit more than 20 million. And they want to push the urban population growth to smaller cities. I think that the government has been keen to grow third and fourth tier cities ever since the 1980s. It didn't happen, it didn't happen, it didn't happen. But they keep coming up with new policies to promote the growth of those cities. This comes from the book, the fat book, Ball, Lin, and Wetzel, that Om is probably familiar with. Cities have, metropolitan governance is very complex because as cities grow, they tend to encompass these surrounding regions without the administrative changes that are associated. So Sao Paulo has 39 autonomous municipalities within its borders. That makes coordination sometimes very difficult. Mexico City has 2 states, a federal district, and 50 local governments, 50 plus local governments. So we were given a tour. I was taken on a tour of Delhi a couple of days ago, very kindly by Partha, sitting in the back. And we saw that Delhi also encompasses 2 states, more than 2 states, 3 states, okay, and multiple local governments. And then you have the vertical challenge. You know, when the city grows to encompass the surrounding, and surround these administrative units, who has authority to do what? You know, you have the political status and authority, and the fiscal treatment. Who gets to collect what taxes? How much revenue is shared across the vertical system, etc. And in China, actually, it's very clear what the central and provincial relationships are, but it's up to each province to negotiate below how to treat the sub-provincial relationships. And cities face enormous demand for public expenditures. Right? You have population growth, you have more people needing services, you have growing incomes in cities, and rising expectations of what the public sector should be providing to them. Globalization means that cities are competing against cities in other countries in the world. And so you need to keep up with the competition for talent and investment globally, not just domestically. And then mobility. You have more automobiles, you have more subways. That means that people are moving out and extending further from the urban center. You have urban sprawl everywhere in the world, which stretches city resources, in providing infrastructure and services. You need to build schools further out to accommodate people living in the suburbs and so on. So these are things that are changing how cities have to be financed. And cities are just very expensive. They need infrastructure. You need infrastructure to support residential neighborhoods. You need infrastructure to support factories, industrial zones. You need to have hospitals, clinics, schools, water and sewer systems, electric cables, waste disposal, roads and streets, etc., public transportation. And then we now have climate change that's already impacting how cities have to think about infrastructure and what kind of infrastructure. So I come from Singapore. I've been living in Singapore, which has fantastic infrastructure. Right? Those of you who visited, we have torrential rain almost every day, and within 3 minutes of the rain stopping, you don't know that it's been raining because the water just magically disappears into the sewers. But even in Singapore, the government is now planning to expand the sewer systems because we've had some flooding on the streets because the rains are more torrential and they last longer. So climate change is happening very fast. Metropolitan infrastructure, who's responsible, who builds it? Well, most of it is local, right? If you think about the infrastructure that's needed, city streets, local bridges, subways, water systems, schools, health institutions, these are all local, right? So they're mostly built by local governments. I found it's very hard to get data on infrastructure spending, any aggregate numbers. So I have this one number that I've been working with from OECD 2011. So for all of the OECD countries together, they said that roughly $1 trillion, US dollars, was spent on infrastructure during that year. 2/3 of it by local governments. But they were carried out by local governments, but funded by national governments and by the EU, so supranational bodies. Very little local government funding because local governments tend to have very weak tax bases and they have relatively little fiscal revenues. Right? So how is infrastructure funded? The costs are far too large to be borne by tax revenues, and it would be unfair to use only tax revenues to fund capital spending because the benefit period will be very long. It shouldn't be paid for by the current taxpayers. So the benefit period and the payment period should be matched as much as possible. So borrowing is typically thought to be both efficient and fair for funding infrastructure. Development charges, you have one-time levies and PPPs, public-private partnerships, and land value capture. And I thought land value capture is worth talking about because China uses it a lot, but that it's a model for financing large-scale urban development. It started in the Paris Haussmann transformation project in the 19th century, where Haussmann, he was finance minister or planning minister, I forget. You're the urban person. But anyway, he used the expropriation power of government to force, clearance of large amounts of Paris neighborhoods, so that this large-scale clearance and development allowed him to redesign the streets, pattern of streets, buildings, and so on. And you see this uniformity in the center of Paris of these buildings and nice planned streets, etc. And he, in his memoirs, he said that he displaced 350,000 people, spent huge amounts of treasury, and employed 1 in 5 Parisian workers in this rehabilitation project. But it created a new city. And the way he did it was that he bought the land and the buildings and used the land as collateral to borrow from the banks, and used the money then to redevelop these neighborhoods. Right. This is worth thinking about because in one of the British legacies, colonial legacies, is that there's a lot of crown land. Right? In Hong Kong and Singapore, the treasuries are enriched by land auctions so that they can keep the tax rates very low because they have this alternative source of income. India probably has some crown land left from that period. And China doesn't have this colonial legacy, but state-owned land. The state has control over land. All land is state-owned in the countryside, certainly. And so Chinese cities have been using this model quite extensively. The difference is that both Hong Kong and Singapore are limited municipalities. There's a fixed boundary. Chinese cities have no boundaries. No, you can just keep going. So the Chinese model is very much like the Haussmann Paris project in that local governments were not allowed to borrow. Okay? So they had no tax autonomy under the Chinese fiscal system. Central government sets taxes, and sets tax rates and determines how to share with local governments. Local governments can only use what they have under the assignment system, and they were not allowed to borrow. And then in the 1980s and 1990s, when China started urbanizing, so under the planned economy, China did not urbanize. In 1998, urbanization rate was 18%. Today, it's about 66%. And all of that, happened from 1980 onward, but really from 1990 onward, because in the planned economy, population was kept in place by the food rationing system. Grain was rationed, so if you want to go drift off to the city to work, first of all, you're not allowed. Secondly, how do you feed yourself? To buy, rice or bread in the cities, you need to have a grain coupon, which was only given to urban population. So people did go to the city in small numbers. They have to bring their sack of rice with them. So that limits the amount of mobility and the feasibility of moving. So this changed only in 1993. And so you can think about urbanization as 1990s onward phenomenon. Okay. Huge. During 1980 to 1990, as the planned economy was being dismantled, the government lost control over its revenue mechanism, which was dependent on state-owned enterprises. And the budget fell from 1/3 of GDP to 10% of GDP in 1996 when it hit bottom, before they rolled out a big reform to introduce new taxes and rebuilt the revenue mechanism. So urbanization started at a time when the government's budget was declining, in a free fall. There was no money to do anything. And during that period, the central government just folded its arms and said, well, pull up yourself by your bootstraps and do it yourself. Left it to local governments at all levels, both rural and urban. So how did they manage to urbanize? Land was one of the state assets that they could monetize, and the Constitution gives the monopoly of converting farmland to non-farm use to local governments. There's no land market in which a farmer can sell land. You have to sell it to local government, and only certain kinds of land can be sold. And so the way the local governments got around the prohibition on borrowing was to create corporate entities to borrow on behalf of local governments. I'm looking at the clock and realize I need to skip some of the details. Okay, so you have these, you probably read about these LGFVs, local government financial vehicles. They were created to borrow money for local governments. The way it works is that local government would acquire farmland, give it to the LGFV, which would use the land as collateral, borrow from the banks, and then use the money to develop the land, sell it, and then give the money back to local governments. And as China was growing at 10% a year, and it was urbanizing like mad, this was an incredibly rich source of revenue. It's an ATM that local governments just went back to over and over. And you have, cities growing and taking up more and more farmland and getting the money to spend on infrastructure. The government never officially approved the creation of these things. They just didn't disapprove it, right? They didn't ban them. So this is with an unregulated sector. Everybody knew that they were there, and everybody knew they were borrowing, and it didn't become an issue until the financial crisis in 2008, when the government rolled out this 4 trillion yuan in stimulus package and encouraged local governments to use it to build infrastructure. And money was flying out of the banks, and new LGFVs were being created every day to borrow this money. And in 2009, in the first quarter, they suddenly realized that 40% of bank lending nationwide was going to things called LGFVs. Okay, and then government took notice and thought, what are LGFVs? Who are they? What are they borrowing money to do? How is the money being spent? And they discovered that nobody had any information about them. I mean, there are no aggregate statistics because the Ministry of Finance said, this is not our business. You know, they're not using budget money. We look after the budget. So if they're borrowing from the banks, it's the bank's problem. And the central bank was not looking after them because this is market operation. They're borrowing money. It's, you know, we're not asked to track them. Nobody in the planning, you know, the NDRC that looks after physical infrastructure and so on. Nobody was paying any attention. So this is how it happened. And they need the land, right? There's a symbiotic relationship between land and LGFVs because they need the land as collateral to borrow. And the LGFVs were playing an instrumental role as intermediaries in accessing financial capital for building infrastructure. And local governments use land more and more. And you can see the land revenues grew from 0 to, what's the number, 8 or 9% of GDP in 2020. And they depend on land revenues as the principal source of infrastructure investment. There's no other source. Right? And land and real estate also brought in taxes, tax revenues. They pay, you know, deed tax, title tax, you know, stamp duty kind of thing, and it actually accounts for a quarter to a third of tax revenues on top of the land revenue is extra budget, right? So it's a very, very important source of financing for urban development in China. And they face soft budget constraint because nobody's looking after them. You know, in Chinese, we say they have no mothers-in-law. You know, there's no regulatory body asking them for information on what they're doing. And so you have this interplay that led to overuse. Let me get quickly to this picture, which is China's infrastructure investment as a proportion of GDP. Okay. It rose with the growth of these LGFVs from 9% roughly of GDP in the early 2000s through the financial crisis period when they climbed all the way up to 17% of GDP. And so coming back to this one number that I have to work with, the $1 trillion OECD investment in infrastructure. In the year 2011, China invested an equivalent of 84% of all the OECD countries together in infrastructure. 84%, yes. And more than 3/4 of it was financed by local governments. Okay? So the question then comes, how much should a country invest in infrastructure? You know, so India, Dr. Roy said, India doesn't invest enough, and China invests too much, but what's the right number? So there's this study by Ingram, your old friend Ingram, and Liu Zhi is in the Lincoln Institute and Brent. I think this comes from about mid-2010s. The data is from, they used 2008 dollars, constant prices. So they looked at, you know, they ran big regressions across a large pool of countries to see who's doing what, how much is being invested in infrastructure. And so you have low-income countries and lower using the World Bank classification, lower middle, you know, lower middle, upper middle, developing country, total high income countries, and then all countries together. And they came to the data says that high income countries tend to invest less because they already have infrastructure. Developing countries need to invest more to build the infrastructure, to create the infrastructure. And how much you need to be investing depends on your starting point, and it depends on your growth rate. If you're going faster, you need to invest more, right? So, and if you say China is an upper middle income country, if it were growing at 5% per year, then the regression says on average a country like China should be investing 3.7% of GDP in infrastructure. And part of that would go to creating new infrastructure, and part of it would go to maintenance. Maintenance and repair and so on. So China was growing at 10% a year, and therefore it should have been investing, say, 7 or 8% per year in infrastructure. But instead, it's investing 12 to 15% a year. So the IMF has done a study that says China was underinvesting in the 1990s, and now since 2003 or so, it's been overinvesting, and since 2008, it's been super overinvesting. Okay, this is the principal source of the local government debt, and these are the numbers. These are estimates. Nobody really knows, right? But the number is very big, and it's growing, and it's squeezing out other expenditures, public expenditures. And it also leads to very high housing prices. This data, this is from a Bloomberg article. The data is not strictly speaking comparable for US cities than for Chinese cities, but I think that the overall impression is correct that Chinese cities are the most unaffordable in the world. And then I just want to mention this. The second problem of this municipal finance model that China's been following, that's very decentralized, decisions made at the city level or district level on how to finance, what to do, also created a two-tier society in China, where, you know, in the 1980s, 1990s, and into the early 2000s, cities had very, very tight budgets. Okay, you were in that steep fiscal decline. You have huge numbers of people coming in, needing school places, needing housing, needing all kinds of things. And cities didn't have the money. And so a rational city mayor would think, what can I do to limit the demands? There's the hukou, which is the registration that every Chinese citizen has at birth that says you are a citizen of county X and you are urban or you are rural. Okay? And the obligation of local government under this very decentralized model is to its own citizens. Is to own citizens. Okay? So Beijing, Shanghai has an obligation to provide services to Beijing citizens. If you are a migrant worker coming in to work in Beijing, sorry, you don't have a Beijing hukou. So it's a very convenient handle for separating out, you know, who you can exclude from your services.
You mean these 29% that you're talking about?
Sorry, which one?
The
39%. Yes.
39%.
Yes, that's right.
Is this,
So I need to turn over. So this model was set in the 1980s and 1990s, and the central government did not intervene at the time because the central government also didn't have money. Okay, and only around the turn of the 20th to 21st century did the central government take an interest in this, and they started saying you need to provide services to everyone. And every child has the right to be schooled locally in state schools. But they cannot implement. Even today, migrant children have trouble accessing state schools. So this benign neglect from the top turns out to be very difficult to reverse. Right? The inequality is baked in, and China is now a two-tier society in the 2020 census. So in 2010, there was a new urbanization model where everybody should be, new citizens should have all the same rights, and hukou distinctions should gradually disappear. 10 years later, in the 2020 census, you learned that 29% of urban population do not have local hukou and total rights. And that's 261 million people in cities. Out of the 900 plus million, almost 30% of them don't have full rights of citizenship.
I mean, they would be without services. 260 million people.
Yes, well, they have
basic services.
they have access to services like they can go to parks, they can take public transport. You can't exclude them. But the key services, the most expensive services, are education, healthcare. They can go to hospitals, but they will have to pay different price, and they have different access to health insurance, and they don't have access to the same pensions as urban hukou people, and so on. So there are some very significant differences in their citizenship rights. So, just to sum up quickly, decentralized model of municipal finance has achieved great successes in many ways, but it's also created these huge, intractable problems that the current government is trying to grapple with.
Thank you so much, Professor Wong. I think that was a master class, and actually it brought out some similarities with the Indian system, right? I was so fascinating. Before Professor Mathur, you want to come in at this point with any observation? Because I noted down a few questions and the list kept on growing, so I just want to be sensitive of the time, so that's why I'm asking. So I just have a couple of questions, Professor Wong, and then I'll open it up for questions from the audience. I did a paper on house prices in India, and that also showed that housing is not, house prices are very high in Chinese cities also, and you also showed that. Mm-hmm. Now, couple of things don't add up for me, which is when local governments use land as a resource to fund infra, and prices are high, that means local governments are acting as monopolists in the land market, right? In which the price of the goods sold is high. So how do you still manage high growth in Chinese cities, right? I mean, we are facing the same problem because prices are high, and because land supply is not coming in as much as it is needed. But as a result, our cities don't grow as fast. So how do Chinese cities how have Chinese cities still managed to grow at the fast pace? That is first question. Second related observation which came from your presentation, that the Chinese urban story started post 1993, right? Is what you said. But China's economic growth miracle of double digit started from 1980s. So roughly from 80 to 95, China's economy grew at double digit, but not apparently led by Chinese cities, or as we understand Chinese cities. So I'm a bit puzzled, and basically what I'm saying is, how has China managed to grow fast in this model of urbanization, which is where land is expensive? Thank you.
Okay, so let me take them one, in that order. The house prices, I don't think house prices are very closely related to economic growth. And that's true in the US as well as in China, where, San Francisco, New York have very high house prices, but these are also cities that have been growing. So I don't think there's any particular linkage. On the 1980 to 1995, China was growing. I'm not sure it was yet double digit, but close, maybe 8% or so. It was urbanizing. It's just not as urbanizing. The really rapid, steep urbanization probably took off after 1995. But China was already urbanizing at that time.
Okay. I think I would like to open up questions from the floor. So whoever wants to ask. Let's make it okay, sure. Lavish. And maybe we take 3 questions. I mean, a batch of 3 questions in one. Yeah, if that is okay.
I'll try to remember them.
Or we can take one question. I mean, whatever is better for you.
One by one. That would be so.
Very quickly, what did China, how are cities run, and how did they so quickly change from fairly, stage models of urban governance to such a dynamic part of Chinese growth? And that's just within 10 years. So what did they really do?
Please, Ambassador.
Should I ask the question, or do you want to take it one by one?
Maybe let me take it one by one. I try not to take too much time so that there are more questions that can be asked. I'm not a political scientist, so I'm probably not qualified to answer your question. But it's about scholars who look at Chinese performance over the last 40 years, talk about local competition. Okay. So all the cities are competing with each other. So bureaucrats are competing. Shanghai does one thing, then other cities try to imitate and do better on that. So it's about incentives. And you get promoted if you can produce higher performance. Economic growth is a good indicator that everybody was looking at, especially in the early period. So you try to bring in more businesses to grow the city. Am I answering your question? Or? Yeah. Okay.
Dr. Bhagwati.
I'm seeking a clarification more than a question. I thought I heard you say that cities have no limits in China, and you can expand expropriating agricultural land, which should in normal cases create a political problem because the farmers who have lost their land, unless they were compensated some way, and I don't know how they were compensated and at what rates, and then once you've acquired that land, then you borrow against it, and then subsequently you service your debt once the land which is agricultural has become urban, and then you build multi-story housing or whatever, something which then can create revenues. Now this seems only possible in a system which is top-driven, whether it was the local government or was it the central government in Beijing, which decides, because when you acquire land from farmers in a country like India, of course, that could lead to all kinds of issues. So were there such issues in China, and if so, how did they manage those, which I would call more political economy kind of issues? Because otherwise this whole finance model doesn't work unless you have that political economy situation on top.
Yeah, if I may, I mean, it would be helpful to understand what do you mean by local governments in that? Because local governments in our case also include state governments, and they have a right to acquire land, but not cities, right? So,
Saul probably knows the answer. I believe it's local government means below provincial level. Provinces don't really acquire land in that sense. so it's locally. Now, farmers protest. They're compensated. They protest, but there's a limit to what they can protest about because the Constitution says or maybe this is a land law that says the price of procurement for farmland is fixed as multiples of the historical yield of farm output, which was very low. So there's a very low purchase price for farmland. The local government also provides some compensation for relocation, and that compensation has been going up over time. But still, there's a fixed price. You can protest, and they do have protests, and protest about being pushed off the land and being unfairly compensated too low is the biggest source of protest in China. The Public Security Ministry used to publish a journal, I don't know if they discontinued that, that talks about the number of events, protest events. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands a year of protests in the 1990s and early 2000s. But also China was growing very fast, and many, many people, especially suburban areas, people were going to the cities and working in factories and working in other things where they were earning incomes that were multiple times what they used to earn. So there was less, motivation for protesting.
But they did have that card, or whatever that.
Hukou, yeah.
Hukou, yeah.
Without
Hukou.
that.
Without the hukou, so their
Yeah.
children can't be educated.
Right, so China has a big social problem of what are called stay-at-home children. So it's too expensive to bring your kids into the cities because housing prices are very high, and also you can't get them into schools. So you leave them at home with grandparents, and then now grandparents are too old to take care of them properly. So you have social problems of children dropping out of school and so on. So there's a host of other problems.
Just one.
Please.
Christine, if my figures are right, I thought the land expropriation rate in China for urbanization was anywhere between 6 to 7% per annum.
6 to
To
7.
7% per annum. This is the rate at which land was being expropriated for urban use in China over the past 20 years or so. I mean, that is what one of the papers in the book mentions. 6%.
Okay, I don't know that number.
But you will find this housing outside of the main city, which I would believe would be unregulated, uncontrolled, but massive housing without any permission, including outside, I think outside of Wuhan, massive housing. And all people without hukou living there.
Who manages sorry to interrupt, who manages these building safety and things of that sort? We have it in Gurgaon, every now and then one building collapses. I don't go to Gurgaon.
I don't know.
Collapse. No, but these are important questions. If you have unrestricted building, God knows what's happening.
Just amazing housing development. Miles and miles you keep on driving, and you see nothing else but empty housing or occupied by non-hukou. Just massive housing.
Before we move to the next set of questions, just one clarification, right? When you said those people who sold off their land and they started working in factories, so I mean they must be typical farmers, right? Before. So I mean, there was what kind of skills? Because in manufacturing jobs you require different kinds of skills. So that is one big thing in India, right? I mean so I mean, how did that transition happen? That someone who's farming yesterday sold off the land and is employed in a manufacturing industry. The skill, so how did the skill or reskilling happen?
On the job. I think,
On job.
That's very interesting.
you get a low-skilled job and you learn and you can be advanced if you are good at it and stay at it. You know, Foxconn, which is now moving to India, but lots of factories in China that employ workers.
Very interesting. Dr. Mohan?
Thanks. Couple of questions. One, on the people who get dispossessed of their land which is acquired. As you would know, Japan, Korea, etc., have used what they used to call the land readjustment schemes. Readjustment schemes, which is that the people from whom you acquire the land get a portion, 10%, 20% or something, of what then the government gets for selling the land. So that was one of the ways that Japan and Korea did financing, and of course keeping down the protests, because they got pretty good compensation, but after it was sold. I don't know if that has happened in Korea at all.
No, I don't really know the Korean, Japanese cases. I watch a lot of K-drama, and there seems to be a lot of corruption involved in the land takings. So maybe it's not so dissimilar to China. So that the transfer of rural land to urban use goes through local governments. But on the other side of the transaction is something called a collective, which is, China decollectivized in 1982. So what is the collective? This is where one of the big problems arises. You have some village elders who take it upon themselves, or you have powerful people taking over the village and managing the affairs, and acting as the dealers on the other side of this transaction, and that's where a lot of the problems come up.
So my second question was actually what Lavish had asked earlier, to press you a little bit, that with this very fast urbanization, how did the governments get the competence to do the planning, the standards, building standards, laying out of roads, infrastructure, water, everything that you mentioned? How did that competence come?
They're civil servants. So the building safety is under the Ministry of Construction. They have departments that you need to get permits. Once the construction is finished, you have inspectors coming for different kinds of inspections, electrical, gas, water, whatever. And you have inspectors who are employed. I do know that they don't have enough inspectors, because if you look at how cities are just popping up all over, high rises are just sprouting all over the place. They don't have nearly enough people to do the inspections. And they are really stretched. And so this is where some of the problems may come in. And I think Ambassador pointed out these, you talked about these buildings that are kind of unregulated, where migrants tend to congregate. These are what are called urban villages. So this is homestead land in the rural areas that are not subject to being sold, in these land transfers. And so if your village got absorbed in a city, then you have an opportunity to turn your homestead land into money opportunity, because you just put up a building, but you don't have full property right. So you don't really want to invest in, putting up a real big building. You do it 5-6 stories. You rent out small rooms to migrant workers. And I just read this guy, who's now in the U.S., said that he managed to get rent a piece of village land in one of these urban villages, put up a 6-story building. He rented out rooms that were 5 square meters, tiny rooms, for 600 or 700 yuan a month. So you can imagine 6 stories. it's a real gold mine. But these are the kinds of buildings, and they tend to be unregulated. And some of them are called handshake buildings because they're so close together that you can just reach over to shake your neighbor's hand and so on. But we have some questions that people have been very patient.
Yeah, take from there first.
Okay, Mukta.
Thank you, Professor Wong. On the slide that you showed about the debts that the LGVFs have, you spoke about how these debts are squeezing out other public expenditure. And then you cited the example of housing. I'm just curious as to what other kind of public expenditure gets squeezed out because of this. And this is related to Dr. Mohan's question about, the other nitty-gritty and the business of actually running cities, which a lot of Indian cities are struggling hugely with. That's question number one. And the question number two was the provocation about the policy moving towards smaller cities. And the policy, the urbanization policy in China moving towards smaller cities. So are the smaller cities following the same model of growth? And what's the difference? My sense is that it's not going in the same way. So if you can shed some light on that.
Yeah. Right. Good questions. Who knows what's being squeezed out? We can only read what data is published. I've been tracking the budget for a long time, and money is very, very tight. So recently, civil servants' pay has been cut, starting with school teachers who are not getting their bonuses, and so China has had this nationally unified public employee payment system, which makes no sense because things cost much more in Shanghai than in a village in Guizhou, but the civil servants in Shanghai and Guizhou are on the same pay scale, nominally. But everybody in the cities and in the rich provinces get performance pay, they get cost of living adjustment pay, and so on and so forth. And I was horrified to learn that performance pay is not pegged to individual performance. It's pegged to the fiscal performance of your administrative unit. So if you're lucky and you live in Hangzhou, performance has been great. So Hangzhou teachers get a lot more than teachers in Guizhou and other places. So those things are gone. So that's one of the things that are squeezed out. And teachers, under Wen Jiabao, so historically, teachers' pay has always been squeezed out first, somehow, because they're mainly women, especially at the lower levels. And Wen Jiabao stepped in and said, teachers should be respected, and their pay should not be lower than civil servants' pay. Boom, teachers' pay jumped, right? And people don't like it. And it creates some other problems I don't have time to talk about. So teachers' pay is now being hit again. And parks are being closed, and libraries are closed, and things are being squeezed out. I think that there's been a hand up since the very beginning.
Yes, thank you, Professor.
You don't need a moderator, I have realized.
Yes, thank you for the fascinating talk. And as a fan of K-dramas and C-dramas, I can attest to their value in teaching us about these societies. I have two very simple questions. The first one being, what has been the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on how public finances are managed? Or because this COVID-19 has coincided with a lot of other changes in how public financing is managed in China. And the second question, in your last slide, you mentioned that Xi Jinping government is dealing with all of these challenges. So what are some of the ways and schemes or the policies that the government has undertaken to deal with these challenges? Thank you so much.
Let me start with the second one, the problems that, so the big problem, one of the biggest problems is local government debt. So local government debt has been growing and growing. And the economic growth has been slow since COVID and has not recovered since then, especially since the government is trying to rein. So multiple problems and the solutions kind of create other problems. So one problem was very unaffordable housing, right? So in 2020, the government rolled out the 3 red lines to rein in developers that are over-borrowing and overextending themselves, and banks are lending too much to the real estate development, and I think mortgages are, so household debt is rising too fast, which are all fueling this house price inflation. And so they wrote out the 3 red lines. Everybody has to pull back to get below the 3 red line, or else you get punished in various ways. That caused the housing market to crash. Okay, so that slowed down economic growth. Housing market was, people estimate anywhere from 1/4 of GDP to 1/3 of GDP is involved in real estate development. And when you pull that back, that slows down growth, employment, incomes, and so on. That feeds into that. And that slow growth tends to make more debt go bad. Perfectly good businesses can get pulled under because customers stop coming, and et cetera, et cetera. So you have all of that. So 2023, local government defaults, there were high risks of local government defaults with LGFVs and other things. And there's a huge bond market. Something like 30% of corporate debt is in LGFVs. And once they start defaulting, that could have very serious financial consequences. So that's one of the big problems that Xi Jinping's government is dealing with. The inequality problem in school admission for migrant children. They keep pushing on city. So there's a certain competition again among the cities to reach the goal of enrolling 100% of migrant children in state schools. Shanghai met that goal in 2010, and I scrutinized the numbers, and they were very suspicious. If you take the census number of how many migrants were in Shanghai, you take the ratio of basic school age children in the overall population, and you multiply by the migrant population, there should be so many migrant children in school. And the 100% enrollment was 1/4 of that. Okay, well, some of it is because these children didn't come with the parents, but still, there's some water in those numbers.
Can
Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Wong.
Please use the mic.
So my question is related to what's been asked before, and it's a little bit political sciencey, but where was the accountability systems for these governments at this warp speed urbanization? There's loads of money flowing in, and that may ultimately be more of the difference between India and China than the fact that there was a lot of corruption and under the radar stuff. What made these local governments invest not just in the big ribbon cutting infrastructure? We don't have the infrastructure has lasted. They built sewer lines, they built parks as well. And was it, one would typically understand it as a top, through the party system, there's accountability upwards, but UNUN has written about there was also a kind of local system of accountability. So I just wanted your views on that. What actually made them invest? And I don't think it's a capacity issue, because this is not really difficult stuff, building roads, and it's not very high-level governmental capacity, but what made these buildings not collapse and what made them invest in relatively good quality, reliable infrastructure and public roads?
So your question about accountability has many dimensions of accountability, right? So accountability, so civil servants are assessed on their performance. So there's that accountability system there. Can you clarify what it is that you're
How come they built reasonable view and there was a lot of corruption involved, we know that. So what made them invest in good quality public goods and infrastructure rather than say just stealing the money and not building?
well,
Given that there was no oversight.
Yeah.
Or it was under the radar.
well, there's personal pride, right? Accountability. We shouldn't put too much emphasis on material incentives because we choose our profession for personal reasons, not just because we get paid to do it. Because I could make a lot more money being a banker than I can as an academic. And I actually got paid a lot more when I worked for the World Bank than when I worked for the National University of Singapore, and so on. So there's a certain amount of pride in doing a good job if you're going to do it. There's a preference for undertaking infrastructure investment compared to, let's say, doing better in the classroom, right? And that is because whenever you deal with infrastructure, you're dealing with projects with money, and that is an opportunity for corruption. So there's some personal, and the corruption is not just taking money from the project, which a lot of that happens, but also that you have insider information about where that infrastructure will be, and you can give that to your family, relatives, and they can do some other side. They get side benefits from that. And then it's also, if you build something, it's visible, and you get credit for it. If you do a better job selecting teachers so that you get better education in your schools, that's kind of invisible, and the results take years to show up. And so that's more difficult to. I don't know.
We'll take maybe last couple of questions, and then I would want Professor Mathur.
No, I think there's.
Yeah, after this, I just to reflect on this discussion and what we have learned, and any thoughts you may have on what is this telling us about feasibility of financing infra in Indian cities. So I would definitely like to hear from you on that. But please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Wong, for a really interesting discussion. My question deals with the development of bond markets, specifically municipal bond markets. So we're aware that the OECD as well as the US have very active bond markets for financing municipal expenditures. So can you talk a little bit about if the Chinese have developed their bond markets? And India has weak bond markets. So what can India learn from that?
Okay, you're asking me an area that I don't really have any expertise in. And all I know is that I occasionally get calls from people who work for hedge funds and investment banks to ask me my view of LGFV bonds. Should they invest in them? Because there's actually, apparently a pretty active market in buying those because they offer relatively high interest rates in this very low interest environment that we've been in. And everybody believes that the central government of China is behind, it will be guaranteeing them. And therefore, it seems like a very good bet. Right. If you look at the LGFVs themselves, everybody knows that they look pretty dodgy. But there's, Chinese government behind it. And China's doing very well economically. And therefore, this seems like a good bet. What is my view, My advice is as good as my pay, which is 0.
Sorry, you had a question?
More a response, I think in the way I see your, LGFVs, if the vehicles are getting term loans so easily or bonds so easily, which is why there's really no need to develop a big bond market, because I'm going to give you an example. I think in India it would be very difficult for somebody to give land and borrow against that, The land sale is perceived as risky by the lending community. But it varies from market to market. Whereas in China, I think it's perceived as a good asset, so they've been able to attract financing very easily. So that may be the reason was an active term loan market, people willing to invest in land. So that has picked up. In India, that's not perceived. It is perceived as a risky investment by most lenders, or a speculative investment.
Okay, any absolutely last question? Someone who's desperate to ask? Okay.
There's one over there.
Please go ahead, Kausha.
Hello, Professor Wong. I had a question about these new ghost cities, as they're being called in China, that they're building cities beforehand and no one's settling into that.
Right.
So how were they financed, and what has been the consequence on the central, if it's not a long one?
There are many ghost. There are ghost cities, and there are many ghost suburbs where buildings have been put up. Nobody lives in them. Whole villages have been displaced, and all the farmers have. So they traded their homestead land away, not necessarily voluntarily, and in compensation they get an apartment in one of these high rises that they've built. The problem is that they're far away from their little plot where they can grow vegetables and whatever, and they get very often they get compensated by being employed as cleaners around these forests of empty high-rise buildings. There are many of them, and the consequence is that the banks are sitting on some non-performing loans, and there's quite a lot of them. And the official who was responsible for the project has been rotated away, So this is the other problem, is that local officials now are being rotated faster and faster. So it used to be 3 to 5 year terms. Now it's more like 2-year terms, 2 3-year terms. Everybody wants to be rotated before the problems show up.
Okay, thank you so much for taking so many questions, Professor Wong. Professor Mathur, may I request you to please share your thoughts? Any thought, but I for one would definitely like to hear your thoughts on what it means for India.
Thank you, Shishir. First of all, thank you very much for coming in and spending this morning here. It was absolutely fascinating talk. I've been going to China right from 1981, when it was just opening up. On my first visit, I dug out, this is the Constitution of China. The newly one, Mao had died in 76, and the 78, the plenary session that took place, adopted this resolution. And article number 33 in this one, which I opened day before Christine came, reads, and I'll just read that one. It says the country is divided into provinces, into autonomous regions, and municipalities directly under the central government. And I'm told that this position continues in significant ways even today. That is what I gather from my interactions with many other friends. The breakthrough in China really came in 1994, the economic reforms of 1994. Somewhat similar, about the same time as our 1992 amendment came. Now, these were not isolated events. If you look at the global history of decentralization and globalization, Both of these globalization came around latter part of 80s and 90s, and throughout the world there was a craze for decentralization. I have a list of 31 countries that adopted and enacted legislation somewhat similar to the land acquisition, our 74th constitutional amendment. There are 31 countries that did that. China came in 1994, and about the same. What was striking about Christine's presentation, if you remember the first few slides and compare those few slides with what is happening in India, you will find a very strong familiarity with them. That what is different about what China and what is different about India. The two things which are quite different now reflecting, and these were shown in the subsequent slide. One is how they deal with land and how India deals with land. For us, it is a private property. In China, it is not a private property in the sense. Of course, there are leases now, and leases being converted into ownership as well. But land still is a private property. Land is a public property as far as China is concerned. What is important, and I think since Mr. S.P. Singh is here from the Ministry of Urban Development, that they have made use of land. At least there are 4 or 5 different taxes which are levied in different forms of land for raising, for municipality, for local governments to raise revenue. And they really make a huge profit on that one and use it for infrastructure development. We also use land. Central government makes use of it. The valuation, the Central Government Act also sort of uses the benefit taxation that goes. Stamp duty is appropriated by the state government, and property tax is then appropriated. But if you combine all the three revenues, they are a pittance as far as land is concerned. They are pittance. So this is, I don't know how the land business can be declogged to raise more revenue in one way or the other. And it remains a mystery as to why is it, right from the first 5-year plan we have been talking about land being a resource, and yet nothing happens when it comes to land. The second thing is really the borrowing part. And borrowing was not, while we have the Act, Local Authorities Loans Act of 1914, China started entering into the borrowing part around 2008, 2007, if my recollection is right. It was around that time that it opened up. And then you created local government financial vehicles. If I might share one fact, which is the Local Government Act, local government finance vehicles loans are greater than India's GDP. Several times, not one time, not just marginally higher, but they are at least 3 or 4 times more than India's GDP, not of course, now the local governments are also issuing debts in addition to the local government financing vehicles, if my information is right. China is worried about this on this account. China is worried about this account. We are hoping that our bond market will begin to show some promise. The lady who is sitting right here is the one behind the first bond, the Ahmedabad bond. She is the one who worked on that one. She's right here. But between 1997 and now, there are only 38 municipalities that have been able to issue bonds. And the total amount is 5,900 crore. I don't know what would that be as a percentage. It's a peanut. It's peanut. It's not even worth talking about. I don't know why. And we have also created somewhat similar to local government financial vehicle in the form of special SPVs. No? SPVs have been created in at least 100 smart cities have been created. We don't know what the story is about the SPVs in the country. We just don't know. There is no public information on that. Something works there so well to finance urban infrastructure. And the same instrument, when we use it, does not function. And that remains a puzzle. China is a puzzle, it was a puzzle, continues to be a puzzle. But then every time you hear a Chinese presentation, you are confronted with a new phenomenon, a new instrument being used, and used very, very successfully. We just don't know how it happens. What is the backing that goes into public sort of buying those bonds and so on and so forth? Public borrowing becomes a very important vehicle for them. But here, virtually zero. 5,900 crore for a size of this country doesn't make any sense. Now these two, but the initial slides, once again, as I said, system is exactly the same, but the same system functions there. And see what it doesn't do. If we will see the early work, research work on urban issues, the 80s and the 90s, our question was a very simple question. Are Chinese policies on urban development aligned with what the developing countries do, or whether they're radically different, including, for example, the urban informal sector? And our question was, how could a planned economy really have an informal sector? But the research work that you see of the 80s and the 90s coming out of China, Chinese scholars, they confirmed that yes, we have aligned with the rest of the developing world. And we also have a very vibrant informal sector, even though the economy, formally and informally, is a planned economy. And one is hard to explain what the explanation would be. Now, these are some of the questions that continue to bother us. That it is exactly the same system. If we see the transfers financing local services, our proportions are not any higher compared to China. Anywhere between 50 to 60% transfers take place from the higher tiers to the local governments. In our case, it would be about 50, 45 to 50, 55. But no one talks about transfers taking over local government functions as such. But here we get worried that no, the transfers are rising, and let's put a tab on that one. So we just don't know how these differences occur in two countries more or less of the same size now, and
population-wise.
Population-wise.
Only population-wise, I must say.
But they're 60% urban. Yeah. As Rakesh said, we were roughly at the same level in 1950. Even as late as 1960, we were at the same level. Per capita was the same, and yet the differences exist. A huge difference.
Yeah.
It is. You make a visit. Even if you visit China, 1 month later you will find something new. Find something. HSBC Bank, the building of that we used to see in Hong Kong, they've transplanted exactly the same building in Shanghai. Exactly the same. You can't distinguish. So we just don't know how things happen.
I guess. Sorry, but I think.
But thanks very much for coming in. This is her third visit to India, and
now she's staying, right?
Yes, and we hope that she will come again.
I just like to end by saying, I think the mystique and the mystery deepens for us with this.
With that visit.
With the visit, the presentation. No, I think it points to our ignorance, I guess, as researchers more so. But I guess lots of food for thought, especially since the government is also now looking at land monetization as a revenue tool. And I would another thought, right? That it's one thing to raise revenues by land monetization. other to use it as some of you have mentioned, to use it for developing infra. Unless you ring fence it, right? I mean, raising revenues and then spending it on something else sort of partly defeats the purpose, right? So I think lots of questions for us to mull over. Thank you so much to you. Yeah.
Manufacturing.
Labor intensive.
Well, labor is otherwise, seriously, that the value added and surpluses from huge manufacturing growth, both for employment as well as for, that is the difference.
And finally, there is no property tax of the kind that we have in India. There is no property tax in China of the kind that we have in India. They are negotiating with Shanghai for a long time, but not yet come to a decision that we will have a property tax.
So on that note, thanks to you, thanks to everyone who have joined. Please join us for snacks at the other side of the corridor. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks. Thank you so much. It was just wonderful.
Thank you.